This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. President Donald Trump has targeted transgender people with multiple executive orders since returning to office. On his first day back, he signed an order stating that the government would only recognize two sexes, male and female. Already, federal agencies have started complying, and that's affected everything from gender markers on passports to where transgender women are incarcerated. The Trump administration is also attempting to restrict gender-affirming care for transgender youth, and he's opened the door to another ban on transgender people in the military. So, what do these federal changes mean for Connecticut residents? This hour, we'll hear about that. And later, local community members share how they're creating safe spaces for LGBTQ plus people across the state. Joining me now is Orion Rumler, who's the LGBTQ reporter for the 19th. Orion, thank you so much for coming back on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Catherine.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Orion, we've learned that on January 20th, President Donald Trump signed an executive order called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. So that's a mouthful in that title. Orion, what does that executive order actually say, and how far-reaching is it?
So this executive order was less about specific policy proposals and more laying the foundation for the administration's broad opposition to transgender identity and gender diversity as a whole. Like putting forth language that federal agencies, like telling federal agencies that you should adopt policies to exclude, discriminate against trans people. There are two policy areas in this broad executive order that the administration could take more quick or unilateral action on, and that was passports and incarceration, like federal incarceration. So that first executive order did affect, it keeps trans people from being able to access updated gender markers on their passports. And it also prevents trans women from being able to be housed with other women in prison. Although there is a lawsuit that's already been launched against the incarceration rule from this executive order. But broadly speaking, this was the order from the administration that just lays out its opposition against trans identity as a whole.
Well, and as we mentioned, that the executive order already has immediate effects on United States passports, which you were just laying out. Can you talk about what has Trump's order changed about the passport issuing process?
Right. So it's been chaos, pretty much. Last I checked, there's still not a written policy from the State Department, but the agency has told reporters that it is no longer issuing U.S. passports with X gender markers, meaning gender neutral or non-binary gender markers, and it has suspended all applications from Americans trying to update a passport with a new gender marker. The reason I say this is chaos is because in practice, I've spoken with several trans people who, in one case, a trans man in West Virginia, he's without his passport, his birth certificate, and his marriage license. They're all being held in San Francisco because his application was denied, and the agency told him, "We're just holding onto your documents. We can't tell you when you will get them back." So this is something that a lot of trans people are dealing with. With passports, they're not just being denied, they are unsure about what's going to happen to their documentation. In another case, I spoke with a trans person who did not have their supporting documents taken, just their passport. And he was told, just withdraw your application and you can get your passport back, your expired passport. But he doesn't want to do that. So it's been very chaotic as people in different states try to figure out what's going on.
And I think based on what you're describing, it's clear the implications. But can you also, because I know you spoke with a few people that are directly impacted by this, what does something like this do to a person, not having those legal documents nearby when they possibly might need it?
Right. It increases the risk of discrimination, harassment, and violence. Because if you think about it, if you're talking to someone who by all accounts, looks like a woman and is a woman, but she's carrying around documentation that identifies her falsely as a man, that can, identify her as trans, possibly against her will when she's trying to access services through different agencies. So that's a key concern among advocates is, someone trying to use a passport can just be denied services or be, face harassment over it.
And earlier we talked a little bit about the executive order. I want to dig into the title a little bit here too. And as a reminder, it's called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. Orion, can you talk about whether there's strategy behind this title?
Yeah, so this title, the concept of defending women from trans identity, from the idea of being trans, is rhetoric that we've seen in state houses across the country the last few years. It's what we saw from Trump himself during his campaign. It's part of the justification used for these kinds of policies in the first place. The idea that we need to protect real women from these people that we accuse of pretending to be women. So it's an intentional use of language that implies or just directly says, we don't believe trans women are women. We don't believe trans people are real. And this is the stance we're taking on it.
Well, and relating to the specificity too, during his inauguration speech, President Trump said, as of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there will only be two genders, male and female. So does the federal government really have that control?
So, no, of course not. The government cannot tell anyone how to identify, how to live, how to express themselves in their gender. What they can do is make it harder for you to access your federal identity documents that tell the world you are the gender you say you are when you're trying to access basic services. So they can make it harder to exist as a trans person, but they can't make anyone identify a certain way.
And Orion, you've done a lot of reporting in this area. In one of your recent pieces, you explored another order signed by President Trump, and it's called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K through 12 Schools. So based on your reporting, Orion, have you seen evidence of radical indoctrination, and what changes does that order aim to make?
Right. So the context for this order, we also see when we look at state laws the past couple of years, especially people probably most familiar with Florida's Don't Say Gay law. So this comes after states, Republican politicians in red states have been saying, trying to say we don't want discussion of LGBTQ topics in schools. We don't want critical race theory. We don't want white students to feel guilty for things like slavery. That's the cultural, political context of this executive order. And what this executive order is doing is basically the same as what we've been seeing in those states. It uses a slightly broader language to enforce what it describes as patriotic education. It says it wants to eliminate federal funding for schools that, promote, quote, indoctrination based on gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology. The way this administration uses the phrase gender ideology is to refer to the idea of being trans, and then the discriminatory equity ideology, I would assume, is a play on words about DEI. With the broad overview of this executive order, I spoke with former education department staff. They describe this order as unprecedented interference into the country's education system, because the education department is not actually supposed to determine curriculum like this in schools. That's supposed to be a state and local process, which is what Trump actually campaigned on. He campaigned on giving education back to the states.
And while you were reporting, what are you hearing from teachers and students or staff on this? What's the general thoughts you're hearing?
Oh yeah, I mean, teachers in states like Florida and Kentucky have been living under this kind of pressure for years already. Um, these states have been banning LGBTQ plus content in schools for a while. restricting how teachers can interact with students. Just teachers, especially LGBTQ teachers in red states for years now, have been told you have to misgender students, or actual enforcement of these policies is a real question. But teachers have already been, in red southern states especially, have already been living under this. So what I'm curious about is how teachers in more blue states or in more liberal school districts, what their school boards, how they might tell them to comply with this, because that will be an area where they haven't been living under the same kind of pressure already.
Right. And I know we've been talking about several executive orders. I'm going to throw another one out at you. President Trump also signed an order restricting gender-affirming care for people under 19. What does that mean for transgender youth? And what kind of medical care does this include?
Right. So the medical care we're talking about, puberty blockers, which you take before puberty, stops puberty from developing. And then once you hit puberty, you start taking hormones if you want to. It's an individual journey of the kid and their parents, what they want to do. But usually then you take hormones like estrogen or testosterone. And so far, the impact of this executive order, that hospitals in Colorado, Virginia, and DC last week, the Associated Press reported that they've paused gender-affirming care for trans youth as they're evaluating the executive order. Broadly, this executive order is doing something similar with federal funding, like we're seeing in education. It's implying and saying we will cut federal funding, especially research and education funding, to hospitals, and universities with medical clinics that are providing this care. And that's a troubling thing for a hospital to face, because every hospital needs federal funding. So that it implies the hospital has to make a choice between, are we going to stay open, or are we going to provide this specialized care to a small number of patients?
And we've seen over the last couple of weeks that President Trump has reestablished many of the policies he's put into place during his first term in office, and including ones impacting the LGBTQ community. Are there any notable differences this time around, Orion?
Right. So he brought back his military ban for trans people. That's probably familiar to folks from his first term. And he did campaign on bringing back old policies. But the biggest difference is that this administration is making such a clear statement. It made such a clear statement on day one that was portraying being transgender as being an American, because whenever the White House announced that first executive order against gender ideology, on the White House website, it was like, this is part of our plan to bring back American values, which is by declaring that we oppose transgender identity. So that kind of really sweeping opposition is something we've not seen, and we'll continue to see how the administration continues to do that.
Well, and as you've shared, this is not anything new that we haven't seen, just in a different way, I think, in some ways. And in your interviews with advocates, how are they approaching the second Trump administration?
So LGBTQ plus advocates and other civil rights advocates, they had been preparing for a second Trump term for a while, but bluntly, it's been a chaotic time for everyone, including advocates. Everyone is working to understand the impact of these executive orders, working to understand the legal impacts. And we've already had several lawsuits mounted against the administration's anti-trans policies, which to me is the clearest indication of how prepared were advocates to deal with this, to have lawsuits so quickly ready to go. But the other side of that is it's been a blitz of executive orders during the first weeks of the administration. So everyone is kind of in the same boat, just working to understand the actual impacts, which, like in the passport situation, can include things that are nowhere in the executive order, like documents being withheld.
Right. Well, we appreciate you breaking that all down for us and helping us understand what's been going on better. You've been listening to Orion Rumler, who's the LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th. And coming up, what's the role of states like Connecticut as the Trump administration rolls back protections for transgender people? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. This hour, we're looking at some of President Donald Trump's recent executive orders affecting the transgender community and the potential impact here in Connecticut. Joining me now is Chris Urchel, who's a senior staff attorney at GLAD Law, which stands for GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, and they're a civil rights organization. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And still with us is Orion Rumler, who's an LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th. So, Orion, I want to start with you here. The military, as you mentioned earlier, is one area where Trump aims to ban transgender people. Is that something that we saw during his first term as well?
Yes, it is. We saw this during his first term.
And do you know if layoffs are already happening, or will the impacts of this order take time?
So like most executive orders, it's laying out a period between 30 and 60 days where federal agencies are being tasked with come up with a plan to make what the president wants to happen. In this case, it looks like there's a 60-day deadline for the defense secretary, without getting too in the weeds, to update medical standards that would allow trans people to be taken out of the military. In addition, I will note that since there is a lawsuit already announced against this executive order, I'm not sure how fast that will move. So that could potentially, block this from happening, depending on how quickly that lawsuit moves.
Well, and actually really building off what Orion just shared, Chris, GLAD Law has already challenged this effort to ban transgender people from the military. Can you talk about what grounds GLAD Law is suing President Trump on?
Right. So the Constitution guarantees that all of us come before the law as equals. So when the government draws lines around a class of people, in this case, transgender people, it's the role of our courts to take a closer look to make sure that the line drawing isn't motivated by improper considerations like stereotypes and assumptions or like unfounded moral disapproval. What we see here is that the president has decided that transgender people are ineligible for military service, and there's no legitimate justification. And we knew that there was no justification 8 years ago when President Trump first banned transgender people from enlisting during his first term. But now we've had 4 more years of proof that transgender people who serve are brave and honorable and dedicated, in addition to meeting all the same eligibility criteria for enlistment that everyone else has to meet. Furthermore, the president has made it clear in his executive order that the only reasons for the ban on transgender service members are improper considerations like stereotypes and like disapproval. So we're asking the federal district court in DC to stop the ban from going into effect before any of the agencies involved can take the steps that they have to take to enact the ban, so that transgender service members can continue to serve. And that's going to benefit everybody because it's going to ensure that the military is as strong and cohesive as possible.
Well, and as we talked a little bit earlier, too, there's some confusion over which parts of these executive orders are immediately actionable. Some might take time, some just because there's been a slew of them. And as Orion mentioned earlier, with several lawsuits going on, could possibly anticipate a stall in these actionable items. So do you anticipate that many of the executive orders rolling back on transgender rights will face legal challenges?
Right. So, yeah, some of the executive orders that we've seen in the last 2 weeks include elements that can be implemented right away. Mm-hmm. And so, as Orion mentioned, for example, the president ordered the Bureau of Prisons to halt all recognition of incarcerated transgender people. And we learned pretty quickly that within a day of that executive order, a transgender woman in a federal prison was placed in solitary confinement, and she was told that she was going to be transferred to a men's facility. And this is a woman who had been in a women's prison for years without any problems, and then suddenly was being severely punished in solitary confinement and facing a very serious threat to her safety because of an imminent transfer and a threat to cut off her access to medical care. So fortunately, we were able to file a lawsuit in federal court in Massachusetts on a Sunday evening. And that night, a judge issued an emergency order preventing her from being transferred and requiring the Bureau of Prisons to return her to the general population and return her status from male to female. So the judge is currently considering a motion for preliminary injunction in that case. And a preliminary injunction will hopefully, we hope, will protect transgender people who are incarcerated in federal facilities nationwide. Other executive orders, as Orion described in the military ban, instruct federal officials to take steps to implement them. And these orders include timelines, deadlines, outer limits for how long things should take. But things could always move more quickly. And we can't predict how long it'll be before the Department of Defense would begin implementing the ban on transgender service members. The people who will be impacted are going to immediately face stigma, lose their livelihood, lose their access to healthcare for themselves, for their families. And of course, unit cohesion will suffer. So this is why we have to ask the court to stop this ban from going into effect before it can happen.
Well, and we've been hearing so much of what's happening nationwide and even around our neighbors. Can you talk about what's the impact of these federal changes on the local communities here in Connecticut?
Yeah, so I'm very concerned about what the impact is going to be on service members whose family lives in Connecticut. Right, this is when it comes to the military ban, people's lives are affected in really intimate ways when they lose their source of income and their ability to work. But beyond that, Orion was talking about how the executive order that targets education. Right, so that's an executive order that ultimately says that the way federal courts have been interpreting Title IX, which is a law that protects against discrimination in education based on sex, and courts have for a long time interpreted Title IX to protect LGBTQ students from discrimination in education. And this executive order is kind of upending that, right? And saying, actually, that's not what Title IX means anymore. Well, it's still the role of courts to make the determination of what Title IX means. The president can't unilaterally change a lawfully enacted statute, right? And so it's going to be a test of the mettle of educators and administrators in schools across the state to stand up against that kind of executive order and say, no, we're going to comply with federal law and state law, and we're going to protect the rights of our students, whether or not there's an executive order that's trying to tell us that we're not allowed to do that anymore, right? And so there is an element of courage that I think educators in Connecticut can stand up and represent, and I think that's good. I mean, and in other ways that people's lives are going to be more difficult. I mean, Ryan was talking about what the medical care ban means for facilities and providers across the state of Connecticut and across the country. Yeah, a threat to funding is a very, very serious threat because no one can function without federal funding. At the same time, state governments are in a really great position to say, we've got your back. And I am looking to leadership in states across the country, particularly states like Connecticut, to say, we've got your back to these facilities that are under threat of having to close down or shut down their services that they provide to transgender young people. So those are just a couple of ways that we will see effects, but there's ways that people can, in fact, state governments can stand up and say, we're not going to let this damage this vulnerable part of our community.
Well, and I think with both Chris and Ryan, you both sort of build this information block for us where you're really showing that the impact is a lot wider and broader. It's not just one specific community. It's when one specific community is being impacted, the rest of us are also impacted as well. And Orion, I know we're going to be watching this closely and seeing what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks or a couple of months. How do you anticipate these rulings will impact members of the transgender community? Beyond legally, what do we know about the emotional impact, which is something that Chris kind of touched a little bit on earlier?
Thank Thank you. And by rulings, we mean the executive orders?
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, trans Americans a lot of them have been living in fear for a while, amid, state level policies that have been attacking their rights and how they're allowed to live in public. And I'll say, especially in response to the scramble to get passports, to get accurate identity documents, more trans people are considering leaving the country. More trans people are making contingency plans, are feeling just in a state of panic that I'm not sure I've seen before. And, I can't speak for everybody, but I'm just seeing a lot more of that. And then on the other side, I'm also seeing trans and queer people try to say, or, they are saying, like, no matter what happens, like, we're always going to be here. Like, our identities, our lives can't be taken away or erased, even if that's, what happens on paper bureaucratically. Like, we'll always be here. So there's a lot of strong emotions going on in the community, people trying to find sources of comfort, which, a lot of times is each other, while dealing with a good amount of panic and fear.
And Chris, sort of related to that kind of support, I think it's always helpful to really understand what's happening with the law. That's helpful sometimes, I think, to the emotional support. And because earlier you talked about there are things that state government can do to safeguard against executive orders that could be harmful to communities. Can you talk about anything Connecticut specific? Can Connecticut safeguard its residents against some of these orders?
Yeah. Okay. So Connecticut has long been a leader in protecting the rights of transgender people. In 2012, I believe it was, Connecticut was one of the early adopter states of protections against discrimination for transgender people. And so, 13 years ago, that was a really rare thing for a state government to do. And more recently, an example is the 2022 SHIELD law that was passed by the Connecticut legislature. And so that's a law that protects medical care providers from overreach by other states, right? So if somebody is from a state that prohibits or even criminalizes medical care for gender transition and then comes to Connecticut to get care, providers are insulated by the state law from the criminal reach of other states, because Connecticut stood up and done more to protect the providers who are serving this vulnerable population within the state. And so there are a number of, like I mentioned before, funding or promising funding is really an important way. Connecticut can enforce its non-discrimination laws, right? And there's laws that protect people, and then there's enforcement of those laws, right? And those are two different things. And it takes a lot of resources to fully enforce laws. But if people are complaining of discrimination, whether it's in the education context, in public accommodations, in employment, in housing, it can be a really important role that the state government plays, to make sure that those laws and protections are being enforced, especially when people are emboldened because of these federal actions to discriminate and harm transgender people who live within the state.
And do you have any resources that you can direct listeners to if they think they themselves or someone they know is being unfairly discriminated against?
Yes, 100%. Go to glad.org, glad.org. Our information and support hotline, GLAD Law Answers, will always be there to take in information and provide resources and direct people who think that they have been subject to discrimination.
And Orion, do you have any suggestions or resources for people who need those information?
I would definitely, like Chris was mentioning, a lot of LGBTQ legal groups or advocacy groups have online portals where you can report discrimination. The ACLU also has one that's active right now. And if you're looking for immediate resources, there's groups like let me get their name right. The Campaign for Southern Equality has been giving out small grants to families of trans youth who are trying to get out of southern states. So that's a group that's giving out like direct resources to check out. And depending on what state you live in or your city, I would always like search online for like local mutual aid groups in your area. Just any queer groups that's local to you, I think is going to be able to help get you immediate resources faster. And then for legal, and then to report discrimination, I would definitely look to share some of your situation if you're comfortable with that in like in the ACLU's portal or with GLAAD or other groups like that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those resources with us. You've been listening to Orion Rumler, who's the LGBTQ reporter for the 19th. Orion, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
You are also listening to Chris Urschel, who's the senior staff attorney from GLAAD Law. Chris, we appreciate your time as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
Coming up, we'll hear how transgender residents of Connecticut are helping to foster safe spaces and support systems. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. This hour, we're looking at the impact of President Donald Trump's executive orders rolling back transgender rights, including here in Connecticut. But now we'll hear from some residents who are fostering safe spaces for the transgender community against this backdrop. With me this hour is Storyanne Niesingham, who's a youth services librarian at Cheshire Public Library. Story, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Catherine.
And also with us is Beatrice Hamill, who's doing her master's in social work at the University of Connecticut. Beatrice, thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
And Story, I want to start with you. You work as a youth services librarian in a public library space. How did you end up there, and what drew you to that work?
It was accidental. I started off as an education major. Was working in the schools, running after school programs, and was one credit away from going ahead and getting my teaching degree. And then they passed No Child Left Behind. I decided I didn't want to teach that way, so I took a job as a barista. And then I got bored, so I started doing storytelling, and the local library contacted me and asked me if I wanted to be a librarian, and 20 years later.
Well, I think most things happen that way, right? That's what life will do. And in your experience, how have some public libraries, become community spaces and safe spaces for transgender youth and members of the LGBTQ plus community?
I think generally, libraries in general tend to go ahead and be safe spaces. Our mission is egalitarian, so we try to go ahead and get all the information from all the angles, even if we don't agree with it. But part of that means that you have to have spaces for all those people. And I know for my entire career, the library has been that safe space for LGBTQ youth, my goth kids, all of the niches that make up, especially middle school and high school. We just seem to end up being that space, and we live for it.
And I think that adds more to what being a librarian means, right? It's more than just me coming in. I'm like, well, what's that book I want with the red cover? And every librarian seems to know exactly what they're talking about. But you're providing a space for not just children, but for a lot of kids who may not have safe spaces outside of the libraries. How does that inform you as a librarian?
I left libraries for 8 years and toured as a science storyteller. And when I started my transition, I'm a late transitioner. I decided that I wanted to go back to the libraries, if only to go ahead and show kids that it does get better. I did 40 years of really hating myself, hating my body, hating my existence, and living for the end of my existence. And then I found myself, and I realized that I didn't want kids to go through such a long drawn out sense of despair. And I figured the best way to do that was for me to be a public face and make sure that I helped keep those safe spaces going. Luckily, all the libraries I've worked in, everybody has been on that same page. We've always tried to go ahead and make spaces safe for all of our kids.
And it sounds like it's a two-way street.
Yeah. They actually bought me a cake the other day, and I had to go in the bathroom and cry a little bit, but It was very sweet.
We all need a little cry, and we all love some cake. So when with that energy going on, Beatrice, you're pursuing your master's degree in social work at the University of Connecticut right now. So how have your personal experiences informed your decision to pursue work in that field?
Well, actually, very much. I came out as transgender shortly after the pandemic started, and it kind of gave me time to slow down and think about who I was and what I wanted to do. And during that time, I had a really, really hard time finding a therapist and finding help in healthcare. And so what I decided I want to do is I want to be a therapist that specializes in working with transgender people so that other people can maybe have a little bit of an easier time with that than I had to go through.
Well, sounds like there's a lot of parallels happening right now. And through your studies at UConn, you also got involved in planning SojiCon. Can you tell us more what SojiCon is and what work does that involve?
Yeah, so SojiCon stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Expression Conference. It is a queer youth conference that is happening at UConn stores in March. It started originally in 1994, the year I was born. It grew and grew and grew. And in 2019, they had, I think, 3,500 participants. But unfortunately in 2020, they were told like a week before it was going to happen that they weren't allowed to do it that year. And then the person that was organizing it retired, and the group that originally was running it, True Colors, went under, and so it kind of went away. But this year, it is making a comeback as True Colors SojiCon, and we're very excited to be bringing it back this year.
Well, it's funny because I think we're talking about different community spaces that's available to people. How does the conference foster a sense of belonging, you think?
Yeah, so the whole goal of the conference is to make sure it was originally created so that queer youth had an understanding that they were not alone and that there were other people like them and that they had spaces where they could go and feel joy. And so this conference is just kind of continuing that, where we want people to know that they're not alone. There are other people like them. There are people that support them. And joy is, we no matter what happens, we still need joy.
Yeah, absolutely. We often talk about joy, and there's no joy too big or too small, especially when you need it the most. And speaking of joy, a story in your experience, how has finding your people changed your life?
No, I'm not sure how to answer that question.
I imagine it's a mix of joy and a mix of perhaps complicated feelings.
For me, pretty much, it was joy from the get-go. I was always involved in the LGBT plus community, primarily the drag scene. Mm-hmm. But finding myself and then finding my place within a larger community, it did go ahead and make it easier to go ahead and take the steps forward that I needed to thrive. And I feel now that I'm thriving, where before I had success, but I didn't feel like I was thriving. I felt like I was putting on yet another show.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, Beatrice, I see you're nodding too. What is it like? What was it like for you to sort of, you found your direction?
Yeah, I use this analogy all the time where I felt like I was being chased down a road by a bulldozer. And so I didn't really know where I was going, but I had to keep running. And the analogy that I use, I say, well, when COVID-19 happened, that was the bulldozer stopping. And so then I was like, oh, I don't have to just go down whatever path I is in front of me. I can kind of figure out where I actually want to be.
And COVID was my catalyst as well. That most people were like, I'm stuck in my house. And I was like, I get to be myself. And as I got to be myself more, the genie was out of the bottle. There was no putting it back in. I needed to go ahead and be me. And yeah, the bulldozer didn't catch me. So.
Well, and I'm so glad to hear both of you have been able to find yourselves and find spaces where you can be yourselves. And there's a lot of people out there who may not be quite there yet. So what advice would you give people who are feeling anxious, especially given what's going on with national policy changes and the slew of changing information? It's been so fast. And as our guests earlier, both Orion and Chris has mentioned, the pace is so quick. It's really hard to keep up. What would you tell someone who is feeling really anxious today, Beatrice?
So I would say that the goal of this administration is erasure. They want transgender people completely out of the public. But I think that the only reason why they want us out of the public is because we're there. We're visible, very visible, for the first time in this nation's history. And I think that the only way we can really defeat this this pressure from this current administration is to continue to be visible.
Be as public as you can. Go ahead and I mean, if you're feeling the stress, reach out and find your elders. I grew up in the reservation system, so I always had a million aunties, and you have aunties out there. There are adults that will go ahead and stand up for you, and by you standing up for yourself, you take that first step forward, and it does get better, even when it gets worse.
Right. And can you talk about how do you make that first step forward? I think oftentimes for a lot of people, it's the first step that's probably the most difficult part, maybe the second step. The steps are not easy, I think, in general, right? But how does one make the first step?
Oh, part of it is throwing caution to the wind.
Yeah, you kind of just have to do it.
Yeah, it's just like jumping. It's like kind of jumping off a building. Not
right.
Okay. I used to jump off a building into snowbanks.
Okay.
From the standpoint of not like
okay,
but once you go ahead and start plummeting towards the snow, you have that woohoo moment, and then you're there, and then you just want to do it again. That was entertainment for us as kids. I was born in the 70s, so they let us do all sorts of crazy things.
That bulldozer sounds like a really good idea. Right? Well, and Beatrice, what would you say to someone who is sort of having that hard time taking the first step, or maybe not having that space quite yet? They're still trying to find the aunties and the elders, and especially if they're coming across difficult conversations. How do you start that?
Yeah, I would say that that's fine. Take your time. Go at your own pace. I was in a support group once, and I was the first trans support group I ever went to. And the woman that was running it was like 78 years old, and she started transitioning when she was 72. So it's never too late. You're never going to get to a point where you don't have enough time. So if now is not the right time, then that's okay.
And earlier we heard a lot from Orion and Chris talking about the law specifically and policy specific. I'm going to start with Beatrice here. And what might Connecticut do in the coming months and years to protect the transgender community?
Well, the most important thing that I think, the most important thing for me is making sure that gender affirming care is accessible in Connecticut. And additionally, making sure that state-funded insurance programs like Medicaid continue to cover it.
Story, any thoughts there?
Yeah, medical care is definitely key. Psych care. I don't think I would survive without those outlets. It's especially now. Right now, everything is just falling on us again, and it's like just piling on.
Well, and I know this is not the first time we're seeing this. What kind of challenges are you seeing that's still there or that you're anticipating?
Well, I have people that have contacted. I moved here from North Carolina a couple years ago. So I have families that have contacted me asking me about, is Connecticut safe for my kids? If we can't leave right away, can my kids come stay with you until we get there? Asking me for resources and ideas and where to go ahead and get help. I spend a lot of my downtime doing stuff like that. answering questions and basically doing ready reference when I'm not at the library, but primarily just on trans and non-binary issues, just from people that contact me online, and try and give them the best information I can.
Well, and you're both in positions that have a different kind of visibility. And Beatrice, I wanted to ask, because you talked about the importance of visibility earlier, and also talked a little bit about SojiCon. Are there any ways that events like SojiCon that are more important now than in previous years?
Yeah, I mean, I think like local pride centers across the state, and I'm sure across the country as well, are always organizing events. I'm as a person that's been to a couple prides, you can find places all over the state where there's something happening. And so that is a really good outlet if you're maybe unsure. And as you asked earlier, like, what do you do? How do you take that first step? Maybe just don't tell anybody where you're going and just go to one of these places and just see what it's like.
There's definitely a lot going on in Connecticut than I ever expected moving from California. Everyone's like, what are you going to do there? I was like, there's actually a lot of things to do in Connecticut. And I know having these conversations, it can be very complicated and difficult. And then, of course, you can't really have this conversation without talking about what's been going on in the world today. But, how do you both find joy? How do you both find hope? Storianne, let's start with you.
My kids. I mean, every day I get to see hope. I mean, from my littles to my teens, I get to go ahead and see and kind of see the world through their eyes. That's always been the thing that drew me to working with kids, was as long as I have that, I never have to grow up. And that makes me feel alive. And that's enough for me. But
what about you, Beatrice?
For me, what really makes me happy and brings me joy is when I can help other people. And so that's really, I mean, that's why I want to be a therapist, was because I want to be able to help other people. And so I have my friends and my family, and if I can try to make 2 or 3 people's lives better every day, then it was a good day.
And
agreed.
Well, and I just want to get some final thoughts from both of you. We've covered a lot in this conversation, but just really quickly, what do you hope our listeners take away from today's chat? Story?
Just that we're people, just like anybody else. We just want to exist. We just want to thrive, just like any other human being on this planet. And right now, well, we need all of your help. So step up, be an ally.
Yeah, so I want to take this moment to actually talk about one more thing that I think is really important to me, and that's the importance of schools. We heard earlier about how school curriculum is under threat, and Connecticut as a state needs to defend that. And additionally, something that keeps happening in Connecticut is Connecticut state Republicans keep trying to pass legislation that forces schools to out LGBTQ children to their parents. And to be completely honest with you, if your kid is not coming out to you, it is because they do not feel safe, and that is dangerous to be outing these kids.
Agreed.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. That's certainly something that we will be following, and we appreciate you sharing both of your stories with us. You've been listening to Beatrice Hamill, who is a social work candidate at the University of Yukon. Thank you so much, Beatrice, for being here.
Thank you.
And also Storianne Neesingham. Story, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.